Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Stephan van Vliet as my guest. Dr. Van Vliet earned his PhD in kinesiology and community health as an Espen Fellow from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and received postdoctoral training at the Center for Human Nutrition in the School of Medicine at Washington University in St. Louis. He's currently a member of the Duke Molecular Physiology Institute within the School of Medicine at Duke University. Dr. Van Vliet's research is performed at the nexus of food production systems and human health, and in his work, he links agricultural production systems to the nutrient density of food and their subsequent effects on consumer metabolic health using high-throughput techniques such as metabolomics and proteomics. I first learned of Dr. Van Vliet's work when he made a few comments on a study on vegan diets in children that I came across. And as I dove into his work further, I got really excited about meeting him and interviewing him because he studies deeply a lot of the topics that I'm really interested in, including, as I mentioned, nutrient density of food and food synergy, the importance of obtaining nutrients from food, and then some of the newer technologies like proteomics and metabolomics for assessing nutrient value, and then looking at how different food production methods, like, for example, regenerative agriculture versus industrial agriculture, affects the nutrient content of food. I also found out that Dr. Van Vliet is working on, as far as I know, the first randomized controlled trial that will examine the impact of consuming red meat in the context of a whole foods nutritious diet versus the standard American diet, which is a study that is so badly needed because of all of the potential confounding factors that can show up in epidemiological nutritional studies that look at the effects of red meat, as you're certainly aware of if you've been following my work for any length of time or heard me on Joe Rogan's show. So I really enjoyed this conversation. I think you will as well. Dr. Van Vliet's a wealth of knowledge on these topics. And so without further delay, I bring you Dr. Stephan van Vliet. Dr. Stephan van Vliet, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much, Chris. I'm happy to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation. I think we know some of the same people, but didn't know each other. And I originally became aware of your work when I saw some comments that you had made on a study on vegan diet in children, and then also became aware that you we're going to talk more about this, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, are currently working on a randomized controlled trial studying the effects of red meat in the context of a whole foods diet versus a standard American diet, which, as I expressed when we connected, that's like my dream study, the study that I wish had been done so many years ago. But before we dive into all of that, why don't you just give everybody a little bit of an idea of your background and how you became interested in this field?
Absolutely. So I did my undergrad actually in business. So I had a little bit of a career switch at some point, but it was really during that time that instead of reading journals that were regarding economy and management, I was reading physiology and nutrition journals. So then by the time I finished my undergrad and got my degree in business, I decided I should probably make a career switch. So I internship for a while in a muscle metabolism lab in the Netherlands. Working with stable isotopes and studying muscle protein metabolism. I got my master's then in exercise and nutrition science before making my way over to the US, where I did a PhD at the University of Illinois, and I graduated as an Espen Fellow in kinesiology and community health. And it was there where my work focused a lot on whole food protein ingestion and its effects on muscle protein synthesis. And I found an important role for what we call bioactive compounds or non-protein nutrients in stimulating muscle protein synthesis, meaning that the picture is a little bit more complicated than just amino acids stimulating protein synthesis, but actually having a very nutrient-dense food can actually further upregulate protein synthesis. So that was sort of the spiel of my thesis. Then I did postdoctoral training at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. My research was focused on obesity. And over the past 2 years, I've been at Duke University, the Duke University School of Medicine, in the Stephan Nutrition and Metabolism Center. And it's really here that a lot of my work is focused on nutrition and dietary patterns and food metabolomics, and we can talk about that, what that exactly is. But it's basically looking at the complexity of the whole food matrix and how the hundreds to thousands of metabolites in food can impact human health, and really sort of going beyond just the nutrients that only appear on food labels, but really looking at what are all the constituents in food and how do they impact our metabolic health. And indeed, we currently have an ongoing study, as you mentioned, where we are looking at the effects of red meat as part of a sort of quote unquote whole foods diet or traditional diet versus a more modern standard American diet.
Can't wait to talk about that. And I want to start maybe a little bit more generally, diving into a couple areas that you mentioned there in your introduction. So one is this concept of food synergy that you were alluding to. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Gregory Skrinis, who's a food philosopher. I didn't even know such a profession or specialization existed until I encountered his work. I think he's a professor in Australia, but he has argued persuasively that we have this, myopic reductionist approach to nutrition where, as you mentioned, we're only thinking about nutrients on a food label as if a food is just a combination of nutrients and nothing else. And that one of the issues with nutritional research that plagues nutritional research is that it doesn't consider the synergistic effects of nutrients as they occur in a food. And for example, an example of this is I just did a presentation at UCSF symposium on functional medicine and nutrition on the role of vitamin D in the COVID-19 pandemic. And turns out that magnesium is a very important cofactor for vitamin D and is needed for, the metabolism of vitamin D. And if you have magnesium deficiency, even if you're getting enough vitamin D, you're going to be biologically vitamin D deficient. There's so many other examples of this. And yet in most of the studies that I see, this is never considered as a factor. Do you think that's a limitation of perspective or of technology or both?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both. I think it's also human nature to wanting to dumb down things into their individual constituents, because that's usually the way that we can better understand things.
Right.
But indeed, yeah, nutritional reductionism, I agree, it's a huge issue because we routinely track 150 nutritional compounds in USDA databases. 13 of those appear on nutritional labels, which are obviously protein and fat, several vitamins and minerals, and carbohydrates and sugar, and also saturated fat. But yeah, it is really, when we look at some of these compounds that are in food, as we sometimes call the human food dome, or the food metabolome, it contains an estimated 70,000 unique metabolites that are potentially capable of impacting human health. And it is indeed in that case where sort of the synergy between those, and we see that often. That was also what I saw in my PhD work, where we saw a synergy between various nutrients in the whole food matrix. Particularly, for instance, one study that we did was we compared whole eggs versus egg whites. Now, whole eggs and egg whites, they have a very similar amino acid profile, but obviously all the bioactive compounds and the vitamins and minerals are contained in the yolk portion of the whole egg. So what we saw is that when we gave people an isonitrogenous amount so that means match for protein, so a similar amount of protein from egg whites versus whole eggs, we saw a higher muscle anabolic response in case of the whole eggs. And this was likely due to the synergy of these compounds within the food matrix, because as previous studies had shown, if you just provide protein and then the fat as an isolated sources, you do not see that effect of an added anabolic response. So there's definitely something within the whole food matrix that it has a beneficial effect. And I think to broaden the point, that is also what we generally see with calcium-containing foods are protective for health. Carotenoid-containing foods are protective for health. But if you would ingest carotenoids as, for instance, beta carotene. There's been many failed trials in that area of beta carotene actually sometimes showing an increase in disease risk, right? Yes. Because carotenoids, they always occur with 300 other carotenoids in nature. So if we then give sort of an isolated constituent, it usually makes it much less effective. So I agree with you that nutritional reductionism is hard, but then also the other issue, coming back to the technology, and we use food metabolomics where we at least are able to get somewhat of an insight in the complexity of all food sources, but I still cannot say exactly, okay, these work together in this way, and this is how it works. We're really scratching the surface on that too, but it does at least seem that this whole food matrix effect is crucial, and here we are at the moment. Also, it is an emerging area of interest. So
right, and the data might be so complex that we'll need AI or machine learning or something to really make sense of it in the end. Do you think that's the case, or do you think we'll be able to parse it with our human brains?
No, I think definitely. But even with AI, right, and machine learning, it's also only as good as the inputs, I guess.
Sure.
So, which is still the human brain. But yes, no, that's definitely something that's coming up now, using machine learning and AI and training based on. It's still sort of based on the inputs, right, that you get from studies, okay. But yeah, no, that's definitely helpful to understand these things. And right now, I would say is what we can see is that, okay, as far as a whole food matrix or how you ingest these compounds matters. So yeah, the best we can say now is that it's probably best to get your sources from food as much as possible. And,
so that's fascinating, and I think it's so important, and I really am hopeful that this greater focus on metabolomics and proteomics, which enables us to see the complexity of what's going on in the background, will lead us to a change in our perspective on nutrients and the role that they play. I mean, along those same lines, one of the biggest issues in nutritional epidemiology, which I've talked and written about a lot, is the healthy user bias. So for people who are not familiar with that, this is the phenomena that occurs. Let's say you do a study and you're trying to determine the effects of red meat in the diet, and you study a general population, and you find that people who ate more red meat had higher risk of cancer and heart disease and other diseases. But the problem there is that red meat has been perceived as unhealthy in the US, at least, for many, many years. So people who eat red meat are also more likely to engage in other behaviors that are unhealthy or perceived as unhealthy. And so it's very difficult then to parse out whether the disease effect is due to red meat or due to those other factors. Do you think that I know you're of course actively working on this with the randomized controlled trial, so this, we can talk about that now, but do you think that this greater focus on metabolomics and proteomics will also help to address the healthy user bias in research, or is that going to be more, at least in the short term, related to study design as you're doing it with the randomized controlled trial?
Yeah, I think it's going to be related to more of the study design. But I do want to point out that indeed in epidemiology, you generally see that individuals that are on the standard American diet also consume more red meat, and which is also in the standard American diet being rich in ultra-processed food, sugar, low in fruits and vegetables. But there are several large-scale population-based studies in individuals with healthy lifestyles, such as the Oxford EPIC cohort that has 65,000 people, the 45 and up study in Australia, which had, I think, about 270,000. And also more recently in Alberta's Tomorrow Project, also an epidemiological study. And what the authors found there is that in the context of high fruit and vegetable intake, high red meat intake actually was actually protective. So and there already, I must say it was not non-significant, but the relative risk in that people that ate the most fruits and vegetables versus the lowest fruits and vegetables, despite having high red meat intake, which was over a pound a week, still showed that the relative risk of cancer went from, I think, 1.2 to about 0.8. So So I must say that you do indeed see this healthy user bias, but at the same time, you do see when people do eat red meat, and also in epidemiological studies, you see that when people do eat red meat as part of a quote unquote healthy whole foods diet, that the risk becomes more or less benign. And that is also what we're interested in testing in our randomized controlled trial, is that if you consume red meat as part of a standard American diet, or you consume it as part of a more traditional diet, which is think about how maybe our grandparents used to eat meat, right, as part of a whole foods diet that's also rich in fruits and vegetables, unprocessed plant foods, low in added sugars and sugar sweetened beverages and things like that. So think of it low as in low in ultra processed food. So we were interested in testing that, and that is currently an ongoing randomized controlled trial that we have. And even though we are about halfway through, what we see now is that people that consume high amounts of red meat on the quote unquote whole food diet tend to improve. So this is a 4-week study, so it's short term, but in these 4 weeks, we see a reduction in triglycerides. We see a reduction in LDL cholesterol. We see a maintenance in HDL cholesterol, reduction in total cholesterol. We see some inflammatory markers improving, like IL-6 and C-reactive protein. Again, not the full data set yet, so I don't know if it will hold up when we have the full data set, but these are at least our some of our preliminary findings where we see that and we're sort of validating the epidemiological studies. So we're actually not that different from the epidemiological studies, but most of what you hear in nutritional epidemiology is because most of it is performed in people on the standard American diet. So I think that is important. So to point out.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I covered several of those studies in a few of my Joe Rogan appearances and debates with Joel Kahn, and it's a good reminder that you can design an observational study to answer these questions if you design it with that intent and if you design it well, right? I mean, the first study I think that I'm aware of that attempted to do that was the health food shoppers study out of the UK, where they were aware of the healthy user bias, and they thought, well, how can we take at least one simple step toward trying to identify a population of people who are making healthier choices than the general public, and then differentiate between eating meat or not eating meat within that population. So they basically just studied people who shopped at health food stores, thinking that that was probably a decent, although somewhat crude way of identifying people who have a generally higher awareness of health. And then they found that there was a huge difference in overall mortality and morbidity between the entire health food shopper group and the general population, but there was no difference in morbidity and mortality between the people who ate meat and didn't eat meat within the health food shopping group. So, that still, of course, doesn't prove, it's still observational, all the caveats apply, but it's at least an attempt to control for some of those potentially confounding factors.
Yes, no, exactly. Yeah. So we're based on some of that data, we're trying to objectively test the hypothesis whether this will hold up in a randomized controlled trial. And I do want to add, though, is that there's some mechanistic insight into this too, because the findings of extensive in vitro and in vivo data, mostly in animal models, but they do suggest that plant compounds can antagonize the deleterious effects of harmful compounds in red meat. So think of heterocyclic amines, nitroso compounds, HCD proteins. Yeah, exactly. So if you marinate your meats or use a lot of spices or have it with red wine or coffee or otherwise a plant-rich diet, you do see that the formation of these compounds is reduced by sometimes 70 to 80%. So it's really that complementary nature of plant and animal foods, and I think combining one food with another to offset the bad of one food to reap the benefits, right? So let's say, obviously, red meat, let's take that as an example, rich in bioavailable protein, rich in a variety of vitamins and minerals, but it may come with some deleterious compounds too. But we can offset those potentially by consuming them as part of a phytochemically rich diet or combining this with plant foods. And I think that is as old as humanity, because one example I always like to use is that in more traditional groups within Latin America, and at least historically, would, for instance, consume clay with their potatoes. The reason that they would do that is they then would reap the benefits of the potato, get the starch, get vitamins, minerals, but the clay would bind to the toxins, and the toxins would pass out of them. So this is another classic example of how humans have been ingenious in the past to combine one food with another to make sure that you get the benefits of one food, but offset the potential negative compounds of the other. So in that case, there's also that potential with red meat, for instance.
I couldn't agree more. And I have to admit my personal bias here. I've always been a little bit skeptical of really extreme dietary approaches that are followed for a long period of time for that reason. So, the carnivore diet being the latest example, I think, where there's no doubt that anecdotally, I've seen this as a clinician, that some people are getting phenomenal results from following a carnivore diet. People with severe autoimmune diseases that have been intractable and have not been able to address them any other way, becoming essentially symptom free and going into remission after some period of time on a carnivore diet. And so I completely understand the appeal. And yet, for all of the reasons that you just mentioned, including no historical example that we know of a population that exclusively consumed animal products at all times during the year for a long period of time, and based on some of the mechanisms that you just mentioned and what we know about how phytochemicals can tend to offset some of the potentially harmful compounds that are formed when you eat meat or when meat's digested. It gives me pause, let's just put it that way, and makes me feel a little bit cautious or nervous about people doing that for a long period of time. I'm just curious, what's your perspective on that based on your research?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with everything that you mentioned, especially also that's also my reservation regarding the carnivore diet. And I think if we draw a parallel to maybe like a vegan diet, you see the improvement in health could potentially be because of the foods that you're not eating, right? It's a good elimination diet if you have issues with certain plant compounds, or you have leaky gut and you have problems with digestion, then an elimination diet could definitely help by taking away the source. So you would initially, of course, feel better. And the same, for instance, with potentially a vegan diet, where if you improve your diet quality, that may improve. Or let's say if you had sensitivity to dairy or something, and you remove that, then obviously you can see a health benefit. And of course, I must also admit that eating a lot of phytochemicals in part of like a vegan diet is beneficial. And we should jump into a study later on that came out a few days ago in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which was in children. But we can talk about that in a little bit. But that sort of showed that the increase in phytochemicals might be a good thing, but that eating some animal foods as part of that might also be a good thing. But not to go off too far at the moment, but yeah, no, I agree that also my long-term reservation is that yes, initially you may feel better because you eliminate some foods, but what about some of these phytochemicals that you're missing over the long term? Will they have an impact on your health and sometimes disease risk over the long term, particularly sometimes with things such as cancer?
It's such a critical point. I'm glad you brought it up, and could be a good segue into talking about vegan diets in kids, which is the way I originally, was exposed to your work. People often, I often ask that same question. Someone says, I felt amazing when I switched to a vegan diet. And, some of the follow-up questions there would be, what were you eating before? And, often the answer is a standard American diet. And so, of course, if you switch from eating ultra processed foods and sugar and flour and industrialized seed oils and all of that crap, and then you move to eating whole foods, you're going to feel a lot better almost across the board. But then the next question is, how long have you been on the vegan diet? And, if the answer is a few months, then I'm still going to be skeptical that it's the best choice, because, we can talk about this if it comes up. In the study with vegan diets, we know that, some of the nutrient deficiencies that can develop on a vegan diet don't happen overnight, right? They take months, in some cases years, and it depends a lot on the nutrient status of the person before they adopted the vegan diet. It also depends probably on genetic factors that affect conversion of precursor nutrients like beta carotene to active forms of the nutrient like retinol. So, yeah, let's use this as a segue to talk about this study that looked at the effects of vegan diets in kids. I believe you weren't the author of that study, but I recall reading a tweet that you did about the study. Is that am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, that's correctly. Yeah, the study was out of Finland. I do want to highlight, coming back to your point, Chris, before we move into the vegan diet. I would say the same could be true for a carnivore diet too, where initially
yes.
you would feel better on that. So that I think is important to point out. If you go from a standard American diet to a carnivore diet or a vegan diet or a whole foods omnivore diet, you'd feel better.
Or a ketogenic diet. I mean, I want to mention that too, because a ketogenic diet can be an incredibly powerful therapeutic tool for so many conditions like epilepsy and type 2 diabetes and type 1 diabetes and cognitive decline, dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. But that doesn't necessarily mean by extension that it's a sustainable, or optimal long-term option.
No,
I think that's where we need to make the distinction, right?
I agree. And also the inter-individual differences between humans is so great that what may work for some person might not work for the other person. That's why also when you have these anecdotes of people being on a carnivore diet for 20 years or being on a vegan diet for 20 years and being in good health based on their blood work, at least, I certainly believe that is possible, but I don't think is possible across the board, right? So indeed, we do know inter-individual differences exist. And if you mentioned the beta carotene to retinol conversion, it varies wildly between people and with some of these other conversions too to
K1 to K2.
Yeah, exactly. So those are all important nuances why when someone says, "Oh, this works for me and I feel great," that can be the case, but that doesn't mean. But that another person says, "Well, I tried the vegan diet for 10 years and my health fell apart." That may not be because they didn't do it right, but that could just be that they have, due to genetic differences, are not able to sustain that. But coming back to your to the study on the vegan diet in children, and I think this is where it gets a little more tricky, because obviously, as an adulthood, I would not question that someone can be healthy on a vegan diet. But what the study found in vegan children is they did have a distinct metabolome profile, and it included lower DHA, which is the omega-3 fatty acids, also considerably lower levels of total cholesterol, HDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, alterations in circulating amino acids, lower levels of vitamin A, D, lower levels of zinc. And what is particularly, and if we zoom in on the cholesterol for a little bit, what's particularly interested about that is that what the authors also saw is that they also saw alongside of the lower levels of HDL and LDL cholesterol, also intermediaries in cholesterol. So this cholesterol was lower. So what that basically means is that the endogenous compensatory cholesterol biosynthesis that you typically see in vegan adults, where sort of the endogenous production takes over, right, and provides the necessary cholesterol, this was not so much the case in children. So that's maybe somewhat concerning, because especially when children are obviously growing, and we know cholesterol is essential for cellular growth, for cell division, for development of many physiological symptoms, because it's a major role in the synthesis of cell membranes, and especially in a rapid growth period as a child. That might be an issue as a precursor. Steroid hormones and also the brain
the myelin sheath.
Exactly. Yep. So that is important, and then also what the authors did was a metabolomics analysis similar to what we use in my lab too, and that's why I particularly was interested in the study, and it was quite unique, and hats off to the authors for the study. But they also showed that bile acid biosynthesis was the largest pathway that was altered in vegan children. So the metabolomics data, and we know the main route of cholesterol excretion is through bile acids, and so these direct measurements revealed that higher primary bile acid and cholic acid and a lower taurine to glycerol ratio showed that there was a large difference in that pathway in bile acid biosynthesis. So I think that's where a little bit of the caution should come in. And even though there's no clearly defined deficiency levels based on blood cholesterol, the fact that these cholesterol levels in vegan infants and children were so low, and that cholesterol produced within the body was not upregulated or did not take over, that might be a concern for the long term. And then rolling into a study that just came out in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and this was a study where also cross-sectional comparison between vegan kids, vegetarian kids, and omnivorous kids. So they were between 5 to 10 years old, and here it also showed many of the same things: lower total cholesterol, lower HDL, also lower B12 and 25 hydroxyvitamin D, unless they were supplemented. But what was important is the bone mineral density was lower, and the vegan children were shorter. So there was a suggestion at least that it stunts growth a little bit. And what was interesting about that, and perhaps somewhat paradoxically, is that they did have sort of a metabolic profile that was suggestive of better cardiovascular health. So they had issues with growth, with stunting growth, but they did show with a healthier cardiometabolic profile. For instance, a lower C-reactive protein. So,
question about that though: was there any context control of the omnivorous diet, or was it just a standard American omnivorous diet?
Yes. So let's go into that, because the findings are relatively easy to explain in that case. So or at least it's somewhat speculative, I must admit that. But what the study found is that the children that were consuming the omnivorous diet were consuming more of a standard American diet. So that means that their sugar intake or sucrose intake was 50 grams, whereas the vegan children, it was 38 grams. The fiber intake of the omnivorous children was 15 grams. The vegan children had a fiber intake that was double of that. And also, if you look at some other indicators like beta carotene, 2,500 micrograms in the omnivores, over 5,000 in the vegan diet. So what that sort of suggests is that the vegan diets were or the vegan children were on a healthy diet, whereas the omnivorous children were more on a standard American diet. So I could not help to think that, what if the vegan children ate a little bit of animal foods with their diet as part of their whole foods diet? They probably would still have low C-reactive protein. They would have a good cardiovascular CVD risk metabolic profile, but they would probably also be thriving and be just as have the same bone mineral density and probably also the same growth as the omnivorous children. So in other words, what was tricky about the study is that the vegan children were clearly on a healthier diet. But I would imagine if the omnivorous children were on a equally healthy diet, that they would have presented with low C-reactive protein.
I would imagine that as well. And that's why I'm so excited about your RCT, your controlled trial that you're doing with red meat, because I think it will help to answer that question. I know there was another paper published by Ty Beal on nutrient gaps in low-income country, in the diets of people in low-income countries, and animal proteins potentially being able to fill that gap. That's somewhat related to what we're talking about now. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the role of animal protein in the diet, the things that animal proteins can uniquely provide, or if not uniquely, are substantial sources of that are not found in plant proteins. And we could maybe start with Ty Beal's paper, and then we can segue into a discussion of the difference between plant and animal proteins in terms of anabolic response and amino acid profile, which is, I know, a specialization of yours, and you've done some work on that as well.
Absolutely. So, and we can also talk about a recent paper where we actually compared beef with a novel plant-based meat alternative, so a plant protein that was matched. So that also will highlight a lot of these things that we talk about. But yes, coming back to and indeed that obviously changes things when you start looking at more developing nations or low-income countries, where eating small amounts, even small amounts, think of it like an egg a day or a few ounces of meat would go a very long way in providing nutrient adequacy. So that is important. Yes. Can we potentially eat a little bit less animal source foods? Or can some people in the West do that? Yes. That is, I certainly believe that we can, and without any issues to our health. Exceptions maybe when you're older. We know you need more protein, especially due to anabolic resistance. Animal proteins are important. Also, maybe when you're younger, but throughout in a healthy adult, and yes, that's potentially the case. But then, if you look at low-income countries, there clearly the protein intake needs to increase. And if we just go beyond protein, obviously, we're also talking here about common things we think of as zinc, B12, iron, but also some of these what we call secondary compounds. And I don't really like using that word too much because it makes it seem like they're not important. But if you look at things like anserine, carnosine metabolite, or cysteamine, I mean, creatine, hydroxyproline, you name it, taurine. I mean, these nutrients have important physiological and anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory roles. So, and deficiencies are associated with cardiovascular deficits, neurocognitive deficits, skeletal muscle issues, connective tissue dysfunction. So we know from randomized controlled trials that creatine and anserine, which are both amino acid metabolites found in animal source foods exclusively, they provide neurocognitive production in older adults. And also cysteamine, also found mostly in animal foods, is a potent antioxidant that has neuroprotective effects and is a precursor of glutathione, which is one of the most potent intercellular antioxidants. So if we sort of, and this is again sort of going beyond this nutritional reductionism, and we start sort of peeling back the onion layer, or in this case, I don't know, the whatever covers the meat, right? Yeah, yes, exactly. Start pulling back the cracking the eggshell, is that we see that the complexity of foods is the whole food matrix is very complex and provides a plethora of nutrients that may not be found in certain other sources. So that's why I also don't like, and I started to get away from this too, using the term animal and plant protein, because that somehow means that they are interchangeable, but they're not, because animal and plant foods provide so much more than protein. It provides a wide variety of nutrients that can impact human health, and some of the aforementioned one that people may not think of immediately, but those can be potentially important for human health, and that is one of the things that we're also investigating right now. And for instance, squalene is another one, which has antioxidant or anti-tumor activity in animal models. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out in humans too.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up, because one of the examples of this that I often think of is EPA and DHA. So historically, the precursor omega-3 alpha-linolenic acid was considered essential. Essential having a very specific meaning in the nutritional context, meaning the body cannot synthesize it on its own, and we need to obtain it from the diet, or else bad things will happen, right? And over time, some scientists have argued that DHA and EPA should actually be considered essential, because in some cases, even when someone is getting theoretically adequate amounts of alpha-linolenic acid from things like flaxseed or walnuts or other plant foods that contain it, that may not be sufficient for them to convert that into adequate amounts of EPA and DHA, which are actually very important nutrients for a number of processes in the body, in the brain, anti-inflammatory effects, et cetera, especially when people are consuming large amounts of omega-6 fats that can interfere with that conversion, or if they're deficient in nutrients that are important for that conversion, which many people who are following an exclusively plant-based diet are. So it starts to get pretty complex, and maybe today's secondary nutrient might become tomorrow's primary or essential nutrient when we understand more about them.
Yeah, no, I agree. And to your point about the omega-3 fatty acids, that is indeed true. And it likely that conversion, which is generally less than 5%, or in many cases less than 1% of ALA to EPA and DHA, so the plant version to the animal version, I see that sort of as like a fallback mechanism. In the case that we don't have it, we can produce enough to sort of keep us going.
Right.
But what we do see in many randomized controlled trials is that intakes of 200 to 300 milligrams, and even sometimes even higher than that, depending on the clinical state, of combined EPA and DHA per day provide neurocognitive benefits. So while you may hit the minimum on a vegan diet, right, because you ingest ALA, it doesn't mean that you optimize the potential benefits that you would get from omega-3 fatty acids. So I think that is important to know, the difference between deficiency versus optimization. And I think that is one of the things that you miss out on. And at the same time, it could be true too for some of the other things as we mentioned. Just taking the other extreme again, taking a carnivore diet. Yes, you may provide yourself with plenty of typically fat-soluble vitamins that arrive from animal sources, plenty of protein, but you may not optimize the amount of phytochemicals in your diet, which indeed are probably only conditionally essential or non-essential, but it doesn't mean that they are not important or do not have benefits. So I think those are two important things: deficiency versus optimization of the diet.
Yeah, that's a really critical point too. And I think that this whole discussion of it gets back to what we really started talking about in the beginning of the podcast, is this idea of moving away from just understanding the nutrient like protein, in a kind of macro sense, and really having a better sense of what the nuances are under that umbrella category of protein, because not all proteins have the same effects. And we know that from the considerable amount of research that's been done in terms of the response of the body to the amino acid profile of protein. So can you talk a little bit about, you several years ago hypothesized that perhaps a blending of plant proteins with a complete amino acid profile would improve the anabolic response. And you could maybe define that for listeners who are not familiar with what that means, but that recent work suggests that even when you recreate that same complete amino acid profile, it does not have the same anabolic response that a complete animal source like whey has. Were you surprised by that? And what do you think explains that difference?
Yeah, no, I certainly hypothesized wrong, Chris. That's for sure. I did think that if and going back to what a complete amino acid profile, generally a plant source is either deficient or in either methionine or cysteine. So if you combine, for instance, legumes with rice, you might make for a complete amino acid profile. And so what a recent study showed was, and they didn't study the muscle anabolic response, but they did study postprandial amino acid levels. So after eating, amino acids or protein gets digested, absorbed, the amino acids become absorbed, and they get put out through the portal vein into systemic circulation, so the blood, where they can then be used for muscle. So they didn't study muscle protein synthesis, but they did study the availability of amino acids in the blood. And what they showed is that despite creating a complete amino acid profile that was also matched for leucine to the whey protein, and leucine also being a very important amino acid, a main anabolic trigger. So they matched the amino acid contents, but it still showed that the amount of amino acids that became available in the blood after eating the complete plant protein was lower than when compared to eating the dairy protein. And yeah, that was somewhat surprising, because I would have expected that the amounts would be similar. And because the idea was, and what we hypothesized in that paper a few years back was based on the current available literature at that time, was that if you present the splanchnic tissue, so the liver, with an unbalanced amino acid profile, you upregulate ureagenesis, so the wasting of protein, but you also upregulate protein synthesis in the liver and in the gut tissue. So our hypothesis is that if you present the liver with an unbalanced amino acid profile, it is sort of a signal that sort of a famine is coming, or an amino acid deficiency is coming, so that it upregulates protein synthesis in vital tissues, such as the liver and the splanchnic organs, and potentially even the heart. So you upregulate protein synthesis in the vital organs at the expense of skeletal muscle. so that you at least will survive until you get more of a complete amino acid profile. So I figured if you then ingest a complete amino acid profile, even if it comes from plants, you would still see a similar response to the animal protein. But that wasn't the case. But what we were right about, I guess, or hypothesis correctly, also based on current data, but this was recently confirmed by a study, is that if your intake is high enough, let's say over 1.6 grams per kilogram body weight per day, it doesn't matter whether you're consuming plant protein or animal protein, because at that point, you are providing so many amino acids that any difference in amino acid profiles is being overridden just because you provide so much.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting, and just makes me wonder too, like what do we still not understand, about the differences and the components. It's kind of makes me think of, as a clinician, like with immunity, the immune system is so vastly complex, and there's so much we still don't understand. And in the case of viral infections, it's often, I mean, you think of things like vaccination, the primary goal there is to stimulate our natural innate immune response, despite, decades and decades of research on antivirals, that are designed to actually kill the pathogen. Still, the best option is to provoke our natural immune response, right? And because it's just so sophisticated and complex, we don't have an easy way of replicating it, other than to stimulate it. And I wonder if there's something similar happening in the context of whole foods versus like trying to isolate certain nutrients or parts of the food and recreate the effect, that there's just this kind of meta effect that the whole food has that we don't even fully understand yet.
Yeah, and you're missing out on it. It also considerably underestimates the complexity. I mean, just to touch upon this quickly, what we did was, and the study hopefully will come out this year, is that kept us busy during COVID when we had to shut down our randomized controlled trials. What we did was we looked at a novel plant-based meat alternative that was matched to design the nutrition label of beef. So similar amount of protein, similar amount of fat, vitamins, minerals. The nutrition facts panels look fairly identical. At least 50% of the consumers cannot really see the difference based on the food survey. So what we looked at was, and this is also what's generally touted for plant-based meat alternatives, right? Because the mantra is a little bit, plant-based meat contains, or animal meats are made out of protein, lipids, vitamins, and minerals. And we can create all of these things using plant products, using plant material. So what we did was we run it through our mass spec, gave it a metabolomics, did metabolomics profiling, and then indeed showed that 90% of these small molecule metabolites, many of which can have important health implications, and those are the ones we talked about, like taurine and cysteamine and anserine and a variety of other phenols, and also tocopherols, phytosterols. I mean, we saw a 90% difference between the beef and the plant-based meat alternative, and this was not this. You could not glean this from the nutrition facts panel. So that comes back to the fact that we just highlighted is that the complexity of things, and in this case, whole food matrix, but also to your point, your example of vaccines, is yes, the complexity of metabolism, physiology, and foods indeed show that there's still much to learn, and that simply us thinking that we can sort of recreate something like that easily is not is not the case. It sort of overestimates our ability.
Exactly. Yeah, and we'll probably look back in the future, if not, I'm sure people like you already are looking at it this way, but at the idea of being able to capture the full complexity and effects of a food on a, small 2-inch by 1-inch food label, that's printed on a package that contains that food, or somewhere else. It's kind of silly when you start to understand the complexity of what we're dealing with. I want to ask another question about protein before we finish up here, and we'll have to have you back, because I want to also talk to you in the future about, I know you focus on farm practices and the effects that different types of farming have on yields, and a whole bunch of other topics that I know my listeners and I'm really interested in. But one of the biggest concerns or critiques of animal protein diets, particularly those that are higher in protein than the average intake, is that they can cause kidney problems. I've addressed this before, but I'd love to hear your take on it, because this is, of course, anytime I've ever talked to an advocate of a vegan diet or vegetarian diet, this inevitably comes up as one of the downsides of a animal protein based diet.
Yeah, yeah. I guess old myths die hard. So here's the best way of saying it: in the absence of any pre-existing kidney condition, a high protein diet does not cause kidney disease.
Yes.
That's about as clear as I can say it. So
yeah, and I found the same in my research, and it's but it's just one of those memes that, like you said, it doesn't go away easily in spite
yeah,
of overwhelming evidence to the contrary, right?
yeah. No protein researcher in the field thinks that this is the case. None of the but it's interesting, but yeah, it always seems to be keep coming back, and I guess these myths die hard. But yeah, there's not a lot of things that I should say that we're very sure, always completely sure about. I would say that we're completely sure about this, but definitely the overwhelming amount of evidence points to the idea that in the absence of any pre-existing kidney condition, a high protein diet is not detrimental. And we actually did a study too in dialysis patients, which are people that have to undergo.
Definitely is a pre-existing condition. Yeah,
it is a pre-existing condition, but there it also becomes even more complicated, because in that case, once your kidneys are failed and you need to undergo dialysis and then potentially hopefully get a kidney transplant, at that point you actually benefit from higher protein intakes because you're so incredibly catabolic. And in that case, higher protein intakes are recommended to prevent the muscle loss. So it does become a little bit it becomes complicated very quickly. But when you're in sort of like the in between where you have a pre-existing kidney condition, absolutely it is important to see a nephrologist and potentially limit your protein intake. My guess would be is that maybe not the protein, but some of the other things that you are eating might be also something to look at. But high protein diets in healthy individuals is not of concern.
Fantastic. I've really enjoyed this conversation, Stephan, and I follow you on Twitter. What's your Twitter handle for those who would like to follow your work there?
It is at Van Vliet PhD, so my last name, Van Vliet. And then if you just Google me and type in Stephan van Vliet Duke, then I think all my Google Scholar profile and social media and other professional profiles will come up.
Great. And that's VANVLIET, correct?
That's right.
Great. For those of us crude Americans who aren't very good at spelling Dutch names. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Definitely want to have you back and talk a little bit more about farming and ranching and regenerative agriculture and some of the impacts that industrialized agriculture can have on not only production but nutrient density, right?
Yeah, exactly. That is mostly the part that I focus on. So that is interdisciplinary work that we started a few years ago, and we're really working at the agriculture human health nexus. So does the way that we produce food, does that impact the nutrient density, and how does that impact our health? And what we're doing is indeed overlaying plant metabolomes with beef metabolomes, with human metabolomes, and see if there's this vital nutrient transfer. So that's
and you would think that would be a rhetorical question, but it hasn't been. Historically the assumption has been that it doesn't matter, I would say, just based on how things are set up, but we absolutely know that it does, which is not surprising given our conversation today.
A farmer told me the other day that my job is simply or that what I do is verifying common sense. But I don't want to think of it that way, because I don't want to think that all my work is kicking in open doors. But it does.
No. I mean, I unfortunately, common sense does not prevail in the way that things are set up. So we need this work to verify that common sense is actually rooted in, verifiable scientific evidence, not just folklore or the way that things have been done for a long time. And that's what, that's what's so interesting about this ancestral lens that we look through sometimes. And you pointed this out earlier, where somehow our ancestors knew about the importance of food synergy and, combining some foods with other foods, or fermenting a food to get to, reduce the levels of toxins, or like you mentioned potatoes and clay, and, people in Africa who consume cassava, which is highly toxic in its raw form. They have extensive methods for preparing it. They didn't know anything about the biochemistry. They somehow learned this over time through trial and error, but that doesn't mean that just because they didn't use science to get to the answer, that the answer isn't correct scientifically.
No, I agree. Though I hate to be the first person who would ever try a potato, and That's right. I wonder how many people lost their lives.
Yes, we can thank our ancestors who died eating raw cassava and potatoes for the benefit of humanity.
Exactly. Yes. Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks again. Appreciate it. And we look forward to having you back on the show next time. And thanks everybody for listening. Please keep sending your questions in to kriskresser.com/podcast question. And we'll talk to you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at kriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/kriskresser or facebook.com/kriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.